How do seasoned veterans of debate evaluate a new topic? They start by evaluating the three core parts to any resolution: the mechanism, the areas or the objects, and then the agent. The mechanism of this resolution is reform. Reform is broad and arguably bidirectional, meaning the AF could make the criminal justice system both more or less harsh from round to round. The only competing literature base with reform in the criminal justice context is abolition, but that is more about debating bad reforms from reforms in the right direction in the abolitionist viewpoint, instead of an entirely alternative approach to solving the problems in the criminal justice system. There are three areas or objects to this resolution: policing, forensic science, and sentencing. These three categories are very distinct and can be fairly large on their own due to what reform means. The agent is the United States federal government, as it is on most every resolution. The agent is going to be a large focus of debates on criminal justice for three reasons. First, the number of potential AFs is quite large, so the NEG may be incentivized to utilize counterplans that do heavy lifting across the areas. Two, things needing to be reformed tends to be true in the criminal justice context. The NEG will rely less on defending the criminal justice system as it is and seek offense through other means, like who does the plan. Three, domestic topics frequently feature debates about the federal government versus sub-federal actors, which is ultimately an agent question. Let's return to the resolution to see another big reason agent debates will be so prominent. There's one key word we didn't talk about, and that is enact. What does enact reform mean? The negative will surely argue, and will be backed up by reasonable evidence, that enacting reform is done by legislative bodies. If the negative has a reasonable shot at arguing the resolution dictates the agent of the affirmative is the legislative branch, how does that impact the topic? It means that the other branches of the federal government, the executive and the courts, could frequently make appearances in the 1 and C, depending on what the affirmative is. It also means we need to understand the pros and cons of each agent. In addition to other federal agents, we have to consider non-federal agents, mainly state governments working alone or in tandem with one another. Let's start with Congress, and let's cover a quick civics lesson, hopefully in 60 seconds or less. Congress has two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 members, 2 from each state. If you can't name your senators, pause the video right now and Google them. The House has 435 members based on population of a state. 218 votes are required for a bill to pass the House. In the Senate, due to the filibuster, it generally requires 60 votes to get a bill to pass. Can Congress pass a law about anything they want? No. The Constitution established a federal government with limited powers. A general police power, a police power meaning the capacity to regulate behavior and enforce order for the betterment of the health, safety, morals, and general welfare, is a state government power. But Congress has many other powers they can pass laws with. The 4 being the spending clause, which says that they can tax and spend for the general defense and welfare of the country. The commerce clause, which says Congress has the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. The territorial clause, that says that Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And finally, the necessary and proper clause, which says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. What this means is that for a congressional law to be constitutional, it would need to fit into one of these powers. The negative may argue that the plan changes the precedential understanding of these powers, and that results in some impact. Let's discuss the spending power more. There are limits on this power. Congress can condition funds it gives to the states, but what they ask for has to be related to what the money is for. For example, it would be unconstitutional to say that only states get money for policing are the ones that have 100% renewable energy, since renewable energy doesn't really relate to policing at all. They also cannot commandeer or compel state governments to enforce or adopt a federal law. That means Congress usually has to use federal officials, or they have to encourage or incentivize states instead of ordering them. So what exactly are some things that Congress can do on this topic that are unique to that agent? One is that they can fund and mandate the collection and sharing of national data, mainly for police brutality, police misconduct, use of force, and things of that nature. Two, they can condition funding to state and local governments under the condition that those governments adopt certain reforms. Three, they can pass laws that are deemed necessary and proper at protecting the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens. For instance, protecting them from unreasonable searches and seizure, protecting their right to due process, protecting them from cruel and unusual punishment, and, because of the 14th Amendment, ensuring that there is equal protection of the laws for everyone. Fourth, they can compel the Department of Justice into action. The Department of Justice can investigate and prosecute police departments, it can create models for the states to adopt, and it can give grants for specific policies. What are some of the advantages that are optimal at proving Congress is key? I think most of the time, 4 genres emerge. First is Congress can restructure an agency. Second is areas where more money is necessary to solve the issue. Third is legitimacy or signaling and sort of other niche political arguments. This advantage would be about how Congress needs to set a new direction. And due to the makeup of Congress, there being 2 parties, it requiring a lot of effort to make new laws in Congress, then it signals a sense of commitment. It also could signal a bipartisan commitment to a certain course of action, all which boost the legitimacy or the signal or the credibility of the reform. And finally is durability. Congressional laws are hard to overturn compared to other agents' forms of action. Now, let's talk about the executive branch. The executive branch enforces laws via federal agencies. All the elements of federal law enforcement are located within the executive branch. These include the U.S. Marshal Service, which protect the federal courts, judges, and jurors, guards federal prisoners from arrest to conviction, and investigates violations of federal fugitive laws. The U.S. Customs Service, which includes Border Patrol. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The ATF deals with criminal use of explosives and with arson. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, this is another area that has Border Patrol agents. They are responsible for taking into custody and arranging for deportations. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which is the federal enforcer of federal drug laws. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, which has more than 200 categories of federal crime that they investigate. They are also one of the main partners of state and local agencies, particularly in the areas of fingerprint files and other forms of forensic science. And the last one I want to mention is the U.S. Attorneys, which are the branch of government which represent the United States federal government in U.S. district courts and the U.S. Court of Appeals. And on this topic, the executive branch will be used in 3 main ways. First, if the affirmative needs a federal agency to change its behavior, the executive could order them to do so instead of Congress conducting oversight or changing their funding. Second, the president has the power of clemency, which means that they can pardon a federal offense and the person is no longer guilty of that crime. This only applies to federal crimes, not state crimes. If the act focuses on changing the enforcement of federal crimes, the negative could keep the laws on the books as they are, but just pardon violations of those laws. Third, the executive branch can decline to enforce or prosecute certain regulations. This is called non-enforcement. Prosecutors, in this case U.S. attorneys, have discretion over what cases they charge. Drug possession could remain illegal, but if prosecutors never brought drug charges to court, no one would go to jail for possession of illegal drugs. Congress versus the executive debates will center on if the AF can win a reason why external oversight is necessary, or why congressional involvement is necessary for signaling, legitimacy, or modeling. which are all questions that revolve around how other actors perceive the action of the plan due to who the agent of the plan is. The AF could also use Congress's spending power to coordinate and encourage state reforms. The executive cannot duplicate these mechanisms because Congress determines what money is used for, and the executive executes those orders. The closest the negative could get with merely executive action is saying that federal agencies serve as a model for state governments, and then they will reform on their own. The disad that will be discussed between these two agents is mainly politics, specifically the agenda politics disad, which says some form of legislation is occurring now and the plan trades off, or the plan being done through Congress creates some kind of trade-off that has a problematic impact. The internal executive action doesn't trade off with current pursuits of legislation. Now, the next agent we'll discuss is the courts. And there are 3 levels of the judiciary in the criminal justice system. There are trial courts, there are appellate courts, and then there is the Supreme Court. Miles discussed the structure of the federal judiciary yesterday in topic discussion number 1. And if you want a more general primer on the courts, you can check out the video linked here. I would like to focus on how the courts compare to other branches, particularly Congress, and highlight the key points of contestation that will happen in those debates. The first idea is deference. It is the idea that courts should only act on things they have expertise regarding, and they shouldn't be overly aggressive in invalidating the actions of the executive and legislative branches. Some judges think that the role should be limited to what the law is, not what it should be. The Congress team would say that deference is good because judges lack expertise and the judicial process is very inefficient or harmful as a method of conducting oversight. The court team will say that deference is bad because political actors are bad at performing oversight. The second idea is precedent. The court team will say that they create a new precedent, which is good. It can more durably solve the harms area and could potentially implicate other areas to good effect. The Congress team will argue that changing the precedent is bad. The Congress team will also try to argue if the court actor is the affirmative team and the Congress team is the negative will try to have Congress take discrete actions to solve the impacts implicated by precedent. The next idea is enforcement. The court does not have the resources or ability to force people to follow their rulings. Congress, mainly through the powers of the purse, has more of an ability to compel action. Both actors can undermine the other. Congress can pass laws that try to take away the court's ability to rule in a certain area. This is called court stripping. Or they could retaliate against the judiciary by reducing their funding. The courts in turn can rule congressional laws unconstitutional and thus not enforceable. Both genres of argument greatly implicate solvency, so the debate will center around which form of retaliation is most likely to occur. The last idea I want to bring up is trade-offs. The court team will say that Congress links to disads like politics. The Congress team will say the courts team links to things like court legitimacy DAs, which say the plan's effect on how people perceive the court is harmful. Or things like the hollow hope disad, which says that court action trades off with mobilizing grassroots movements to tackle problems. The last actor we're going to talk about are the states. As you can see from this graphic, the vast majority of incarceration and interaction with law enforcement and the criminal justice system occurs at the state and local level. State governments mirror what we have described for the federal government. They have 3 branches and a similar subdivision within those branches. Debate about the states will center on jurisdiction. The AF will try and find an area of exclusive federal control or one that is heavily influenced by federal law. When a federal law and a state law conflict, the result is called preemption, where one law overrides another. Due to the supremacy clause of the Constitution, federal law will trump state law when they are in conflict. Uniformity. The AF will argue federal action is the best at creating one national set of standards or practices. The negative will try to circumvent this argument with fiat. The affirmative usually responds with some sort of theory argument. The more evidence-based the negative can support the idea that all states adopting similar policies is realistic, the better shape they will be in. Next, signaling or modeling. Like we discussed earlier, the federal government may have an advantage with internal links like this, particularly as it relates to foreign audiences. States has the farthest reaching set of net benefits as far as negative counterplans goes. Politics, elections, resource trade-off disads, and federalism are all net benefits to the state's counterplan. There are a few more advanced versions of the state's counterplan that attempt to circumvent a lot of the affirmative answers that I wanted to mention. First, the nullification counterplan has the states prohibit cooperation with federal officials and attempts to penalize those who enforce federal law within the boundaries of a given state. If a current federal action is bad, this counterplan will result in action no longer being performed. Second, the uncooperative federalism counterplan has the states threaten to not cooperate on multiple federal initiatives outside of criminal justice unless the federal government adopts the plan. This is a sort of threatened nullification counterplan. The negative would read evidence that says the federal government would accept the deal and thus do the plan, but not via fiat, just solvency. Third, the Lopez counterplan has the federal government devolve jurisdiction and authority over the plan to the states and then have the states adopt the plan. This is an explicit use of fiat to work around the jurisdiction issue we discussed earlier. Most teams respond to the Lopez counterplan with theoretical objections since it requires both fiating the federal government and the state government. This is all I have for now as far as our intro to the topic goes from the perspective of agents. Thank you for watching.